Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Got a fascinating program for you this time. We'll be talking about a mysterious event that happens to all of us eventually, death. Our guests are Pascal Kaplan and Alan Shulak. Pascal is a PhD from Harvard University in philosophy and religion. He authored a book called Understanding Death. He's the founder and former director of the Institute of Mystical and Parapsychological Studies at John F. Kennedy University in Orinda and a former dean of the Liberal Arts School there. Alan Shulak teaches courses in mysticism at the Graduate School of Consciousness Studies at John F. Kennedy University in Orinda, California. We're going to be talking about what happens to you when you die, not just the first few minutes, which are well documented in various studies of near-death experiences, but the days and the weeks and the months and the years and even decades and centuries after the death of the physical body. But before we go into the details, let's kind of set the scene and put all of this in perspective. Could you gentlemen tell me what kind of research you have done specifically, and what is the basis for the statements which you're going to make later in this program? Pascal, let's start with you.
Okay, Charlie. Most of the interest that I've had has been in what's known as the esoteric traditions that exist worldwide. Every culture and every religious tradition has within it a mystical or esoteric history and tradition in which there are spiritual teachers, seers, great mystics who claim to be able to see and know directly, to have conscious awareness of other levels or dimensions of the universe. And they've always taught to the people who've been their students about what happens at dimensions of consciousness, dimensions of existence that we don't see and we don't touch and we don't taste with our physical bodies. So I've spent many years looking at esoteric writings and esoteric traditions from Greece, from India, from China, Japan, and so forth, as well as Christian esoteric writings, looking at issues having to do with the nature of higher consciousness and life after death.
Would you say then that yours is a somewhat historical perspective in terms of the study?
Well, it's not really historical. My interest is not the history of this. My interest is in the psychology of what happens to people when they no longer have a physical body, and looking at the big picture of what it is that why do we have physical bodies? What does it mean to be incarnate? What happens between incarnations? We might talk a little today about reincarnation because that's one of the issues that's involved. It's more of a psychological and spiritual interest that I have.
Alan, how do we know, or how do you know, that there is life after death?
Great question, Charlie. I'm not a psychic researcher, and my interest is not along those lines. I've had no experiences myself that would demonstrate any kind of knowledge of life after death. In the literature that Pascal just referred to, there's a very interesting point of view, and it's one that perhaps other people have thought of as well, and that is the more you live, that is, the more incarnations one has, which run into the tens of thousands, reincarnationists say, the more it begins to dawn on one that I've been here before, or there's something vaguely familiar about this, not in terms of the specifics of a lifetime, but just conscious human experience itself. And you might say from that point of view I have personal experience, because it seems, not this radio show necessarily, but it seems I've been here before. This seems to me like a very familiar thing that's going on.
Pascal, is it possible that these traditions, these esoteric traditions of which you speak, are not to be interpreted literally, but are just figurative pictures of some way of interpreting reality, but aren't necessarily that there's a message there, but it's not necessarily the one that you find on the surface level?
Sure. In fact, one of the main characteristics of any kind of mystical teaching or esoteric teaching is that there are many different ways of interpreting those teachings. And one of the things that one finds in most university settings, for example, are professors of philosophy or psychology or religion who will psychologize the teaching and say, well, it's not really dealing with other levels of reality or other levels of consciousness. It's and then whatever interpretation the particular person happens to have, they then interpret it. It could be, if it's a Freudian viewpoint, it's a substitute for some kind of needs having to do with father figures or having to do with the womb and unity within the womb. And I've read just dozens and dozens of these kinds of interpretations. I think that one has to look at all those different possibilities in considering these traditions. My own experience in having contact with figures who are teachers, who are spiritual teachers, is that, at least for me, I know that they know something that I don't know yet. And I know that just being with such figures helps me to get in touch with things within myself which I value, in fact I treasure, so that whatever interpretation one wants to overlay onto that whole business of spirituality and esotericism, I really don't care so much what the interpretation is. In terms of my life experience, that's where I found more value, more meaning, more beauty, more love, more knowledge, more truth, and so forth and so on, than anywhere else. It happens from my experience, from my research, and from the work that I've done, that I happen to think that they really are dealing with other levels of reality, other levels of consciousness, and that the self-understanding of the mystics is more accurate than the critical interpretation of scholars and of people who are not really familiar with what all of that is about.
Alan, you mentioned a feeling that you'd been here before, that you have had a personal experience, and I'm really trying to nail this down as concretely as we can nail down this sort of a conceptual image. What can you give me an example of a situation that you've been in, that you had the feeling that you've been here before, that would prompt you to believe that there are reincarnations?
Well, I'm going to try to dodge that, Charlie, because the kinds of things you're referring to, which a lot of people have, I don't think I have had. But the question is, I think you could take, for example, the situation of déjà vu, where people walk into a room or have a conversation and immediately feel, I've had this before, I've known this person before, I've been in this place before. Or dreams or things of that kind, which might suggest reincarnation. That kind of those kinds of experiences can be very, very strong psychologically and can mean a great deal to the individual. People in the field, scientists, parapsychologists, anyone who is interested in looking at the data of reincarnation, are less interested in that because it can be so easily dismissed. I mean, it can mean a great deal to the person individually. For example, scientists talk about having precognition of something, but not being conscious of it. So, for example, I might have precognition of our conversation right now, walk into the studio, and suddenly here we start talking and saying the same things that I had a precognitive experience of, and I might immediately think, this obviously is a situation where I've known this person before, I've been on his radio show before, and so on. If I indeed am psychic, and I might have had this experience without knowing about it, and now it unrolls, I might then have the very, very powerful psychological experience that I've known you before, I've been here before, I've done this before. In point of fact, it might merely be a precognitive experience, and precognition is a far removed thing in terms of how it works and the why of it from reincarnation.
Okay. Let me give you an example, though, Charlie, of if we're talking about reincarnation right now. I taught a course at Kennedy on reincarnation, and one of my students, who was a woman in her probably mid-40s, came in one day and said that she had with her a drawing that her 10-year-old son had just done, in which he said that he remembered having been hanged in his past life, in the life just before this one, that he was a horse thief in Wyoming, and that he had been caught and he had been hanged. And there was a sketch of the gallows and of people watching, and he said this was the last thing that he saw. And he had done this just a week or two before she brought it in. Well, what was interesting was that she said from the time he was an infant, whenever she tried to put a bib around his neck, he would scream and throw a tantrum, and he could never have anything around his neck. That he could not wear pullover sweaters. That putting a sweater on, he'd just fight it and just throw it just rip it off of his body, getting it over his head. The child came in to see me a week or two later so I could question him some more about this, and he said that ever since he was very young, he had this kind of habit of rubbing his neck with his left hand, rubbing the back of his neck back and forth, and everybody teased him about why he did that so much, and all he could ever say was that it felt like it was hurting, like it was burning, and that he had a burning sensation in his neck ever since he could remember. Those kinds of things that, it was a drag for the mother not to be able to put a bib on her kid who was spitting up food all over the place. It turns out that at least the child at 10 years old had a recollection of a past life in which he was hanged, which might account for some of the strange and irrational behaviors that he had had for 10 years. And there are those kinds of experiences that I've run into, lots of people who have had those kinds of memories or those kinds of behavioral things that would then get tied into a past life memory.
But it seems that more people are devoid of that kind of remembrance than are people running around who remember past lives. That is the exception rather than the rule, and I'm sure that if you put a total skeptic into the situation, you could find 15 things that had happened. Maybe in the womb the umbilical cord had been wrapped around the child's neck, and
Sure.
therefore he had a physical rejection of things around his neck.
Sure, you don't have to find, you don't even have to find a committed skeptic. I can find dozens of interpretations like that. All you need is an imaginative mind and a decision to find other interpretations for that. I've never really been interested in trying to convince people about any of these issues, whether it's reincarnation or life after death or mysticism or whatever it is that I've been interested in, because I don't believe that one can argue or that there's any value in convincing any one of these things. What I find in the work that I do is that there are people, there was a study done by a Gallup poll just a few years ago which found that 30% of the American public believed in reincarnation. Well, because most people don't, and because the educational system and the religious structures don't teach anything about reincarnation, don't help people to learn about it, even at the most basic levels, there are a lot of people who have a certain kind of intuition or have had experiences that are reincarnational experiences who don't know where to go for information and for help and for a way of making sense of things. The work that I do, the writing I do, and the teaching that I do is really for those people, for people who already have a feeling that this is something that is meaningful to them. How do I find out more? So I'm not really interested in making a case or in arguing the point. It's more that there is information available for people who, for whatever crazy reasons, might be drawn to learning more about that.
Pascal, I would like you to speak to something that, and for us, well, I guess you can't really separate the two. I was going to say we could set aside the issue of reincarnation, but we're not really going to be able to do that. I would like you to describe for us, as you have in the work that you've done and the writing that you've done, the various stages of death. And death is something that each and every one of us is going to have to deal with sooner or later. So let's prepare everyone listening right now to KCBS for this experience of death. What are the various stages of death?
Okay, first we should distinguish between the stages of preparing for dying, which Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and others have talked about, the psychology of what you go through when you face the fact that you are going to die, from what you're really asking me for today's show, which is what happens at physical death and afterwards, which is normally not talked about so much. Again, just to remind you and the listeners that the material for this is based on parapsychological research and on these esoteric traditions. What I found is that there are basically 5 major kinds of stages of what happens after death. Just as there are stages in the growing up process of a child becoming an adolescent, becoming a young adult, and so forth, there are stages of growth in the afterlife. Let me just list those, and then maybe later we can talk in more detail about any one of those. The first one I call the withdrawal phase, which is the actual separating of the consciousness from the physical body. That's what people talk about as dying and the moment of physical death. Secondly, there's a period that follows that which normally lasts 3 to 4 days, but can extend a much longer time, which I call the transitional phase, which is a time when people emotionally and in terms of their psychology really have to get the point that they have died and that they cannot use their physical bodies anymore, and they're out of the physical life that they've just completed. Following that, there's a third phase, which is one of the most important phases between lifetimes, which is a phase of what I call a review phase, or a reflective phase, where one reviews all of the experiences that we've had in that physical lifetime to try to make sense and to try to learn from the experiences we've had. Most of us have had the sense so often of being in a situation, knowing that there's a lesson and a meaning in that situation, and trying to figure it out, but before we can, the phone rings, or it's time to cook dinner, it's time to go to work, and our minds are filled with half-digested experiences of the meaning of life. So during this review phase, we get to leisurely go through every experience we've had in life and draw out the essential meaning and purpose of that experience. Following that period is a fourth phase, which is described by various spiritual teachers as a time of, it's a counterpart to existence on earth, in physical existence, of time of living and learning. It's a study and learning and living phase in what's known as the astral plane, or the spirit plane. Finally, once that level of learning is completed, the fifth stage begins, which is the preparation for rebirth into the physical. So very much in a kind of a nutshell, those are the five phases of life after death that apparently we all go through between each physical incarnation.
What are heaven and hell, and where do they fit into this scheme of things?
Heaven and hell are the result of the review phase. During the review phase, we go back over our life experience, and for each experience, we look at it and make a judgment. We make our own judgment about that experience. And what we look at is the quality of the interaction that we've had with the people that we've been with. And in those cases where we've been supportive, helpful, considerate, kind, and so forth, we can look at that experience and say yes and get a good feeling from that. In other cases where we've kind of stepped on people or been inconsiderate or been downright mean, then we look at that with regret and remorse. We don't have time right now to go into certain characteristics of the review that intensifies the feeling of either the good feeling of looking over experiences that we've had that we feel good about, or intensification of the remorse. But it's those two feelings of either positive feeling about ourselves or the deep remorse for having really been kind of a lousy guy, that when that builds, as it does in the astral, becomes the subjective states of heaven and hell.
Does everybody experience a little heaven and a little hell? It's not a cut and dried black and white situation.
Well,
from what I'm getting from what you're saying.
Yeah, for the most part, we alternate between, as we go through our experience. The thing is that what happens is that for each person, there is a surplus of either positive experiences or negative experiences in that life, so that there'll be a preponderance of one feeling state or the other, so that after one has processed all of that experience, there will be a certain amount of time when one really experiences either just the heaven state or just the hell state for a certain duration. Those are not eternal. These are states that the purpose of these states is to learn from them, and it's sort of like positive and negative reinforcement of the pleasure and pain associated with different lifestyles and different ways of dealing with people that we have contact with.
Can we talk about the duration for just a second, Pascal? You talk about the first stage of death as being final death, and that is, I would think, a relatively short duration. That's
the withdrawal.
How long is that?
Yeah, the withdrawal phase can actually begin months before the person dies. One of the things that I've seen with friends of mine who have been ill, terminally ill, is that months before, as their bodies begin to wear away, they begin to go through a shift of awareness, and their consciousness, their awareness begins to tune into the astral plane, and they begin to withdraw from interest and attention to the physical world and begin to become aware psychically. So that can happen even months before physical death. The actual withdrawal is instantaneous. I mean, when the moment of death comes, the astral body just kind of whips out of the physical body, and one has physical death at that point. So it's a very quick thing at the end.
The next phase, the transition phase, you said is 3 or 4 days. That's the traditional period of mourning when we look at it from this side of the death experience.
That's right. That's right. And there are reasons for that. And a lot of, it's so interesting, looking over all of the ceremonies that have to do with funerals all over the world. One of their purposes, of course, is to help the people who are still alive. Another function, which is ignored in our culture, is that they're really intended to help the person who has died to really come to terms with the fact that he or she is dead.
We think of it just the opposite, that the funeral and the mourning period is intended solely for the adjustment of those people that are left on the face of the earth so they can learn to deal without this person.
Yes, and of course that's true, and that's a valid purpose of it, but it also has this other purpose which gets into some technical business about the fact that some people who die don't want to continue with their growth. They want to hang around. And the funeral is one way of kind of saying, okay, time for you to move on with your own journey of growth, by finalizing that this is the end of their business here on Earth.
When we talked once before, you said that if the mourners are particularly intense and don't want to give up the ghost, as it were, they don't want to let this person go off into the next phase, that the intensity of their holding on can actually keep that person in that transition stage for a longer period of time.
It's just like when my daughter doesn't want me to go out at night, and when I get a babysitter, she cries and cries, and she holds on to me, and she won't let me go, and she won't let me leave. It delays my leaving, and I have to stick around for an extra 20 minutes or half hour before I can go and do my next thing. And in the same way, people who overly want to hold on, and there's a possessive kind of wanting to really pull the person back, can have that same effect of delaying that transitional phase.
Okay, we've talked about the reflective stage a little bit, which would encompass the traditional notion of heaven and hell. How long does that last, or is there a time frame for it?
It really depends on the quality and the number of experiences that the person has had. There isn't a time frame for that, but it is proportional to the length and diversity of the life experience that the person has just had.
And then you go through a living and learning on the spiritual plane and a preparation for rebirth and the next life, and that's where I'm going to turn back to Alan and ask about reincarnation. How does that work?
Well, Charlie, you've got the re-entry phase, as Pascal mentioned, is supposed to be the last one. What particular form you take, the parents you're born to, the land, the country that you're born into, the circumstances of that birth, have to do with the kinds of things that need to be learned. And that is held within the consciousness of the being itself. In other words, the point of view here is that we know what kinds of experiences we have to be able to understand what life is truly about, what our real development is, and so on. In other words, to be able to experience spiritual values, a spiritual life.
You say being. Do you mean, is it possible for a human to come back as an ant or a grasshopper?
No, you can't do that. Supposedly, in all the theories that I know of that are at all sophisticated, I mean outside the realm of folk mythologies and so on, which has been a real confusion, the perspective is always one of going on in consciousness. So that once one gets a human form, almost without exception, except very, very early in one's human incarnations, there is some possibility to move backward for a short period of time. One is always in a human body. It is only a human form that can offer the soul or consciousness the opportunity of real growth. So those circumstances are the key. The kind of life that we live, the things that happen to us are all part of our learning. Of course, what we do with them is up to us. And if we do a good job, then we get rid of a certain piece of business, so to speak. We don't have to reincarnate and do that thing again if we really learn from the experience. So in talking about reincarnation, one invariably talks about karma. If you present someone with the idea that they have lived before, that they will live again, this is going to go on and on. The first thing one wants to know is, how do I stop it? How do I get out of it? Or where does it lead to? Or what is the culmination of it? Or how am I supposed to live now with this knowledge that I'm going to live again so that my future lives are full and are valuable? And so reincarnation, as it should, inevitably leads, at least in classes that I teach, I make sure that it does, into a discussion of what is life, what is a full life, what is the purpose of life. And this, of course, is where one begins to get into what, to me, is really interesting, and which is called real death, not the myriads of physical deaths that we have, but rather the death of individual consciousness and the beginning of a more universal consciousness.
So that is the ultimate, as you see it, then, after we go through the various reincarnations, that eventually you become one with what I guess it's so difficult to phrase the question. Let me go back to something that you said earlier. Rather than looking at where we're going and what the ultimate goal is, where did it all begin? And if we start out with a balance of, in our lives, of good experiences and bad experiences, and at least in the way that we deal with things, did we start out with an even slate or a clean slate, or what's the beginning of life?
You're right.
Rather than where are we going in life?
Right. Well, we sort of start out with a bad slate, in a sense, in that in theories of reincarnation, when you really get into them, they talk about the inception of consciousness itself, beginning way, way back in time, and beginning with forms that to us now we think of as rather ludicrous to ever be in, to actually exist through, such that we were inhabited, that is our consciousness, Charlie's consciousness, Alan's consciousness, Pascal's and so on, inhabited forms of a very primitive, physiological primitiveness, the form of lower animals, the forms even of insects and so on.
Original sin?
That's,
is that
that's right.
That the concept?
So that's what we're getting to. The idea behind original sin here would be that if indeed consciousness develops in a process of taking lower evolutionary forms and being rewarded with a more physiologically complex one for the greater experience of more consciousness, one is moving one's way through evolution in such a way. And when one hits one's first human form, what do you think that's going to be like? I mean, here, for consciousness to grow, it's been absolutely essential and necessary for one to experience that physiological form as me. I mean, there's no question of being able to try to get anything to understand that you and I are one, or that we share a larger whole, or anything of that kind. And so naturally one comes in a primitive state, in the sense of impulse, in the sense of selfishness and so on. And in this sense, I think this is perhaps what mystics meant originally by original sin. We all share this heritage, and now we have to balance it off by something else.